I'm especially happy you're here because this is such an esoteric topic, right? Like it doesn't really matter. It's not like uncovering some long injustice or something like that. This is just like almost like an academic exercise, but it's very cool. What I'd like from you, so if you could, as we go through this, I'm not so arrogant as to think that my process or conclusions must be correct. So as we go through, I think that you should view my presentation with the same sort of skepticism that I viewed other things. And at the end, we have opportunities to share out. And if there's other interpretations or something like that, I'm 100% open to it because I really want to get this right. So this is from Wikipedia. This is showing that this has been a long-standing thing for almost 200 years. The federal census records from 1840 showed a precipitous and temporary decline of Scarsdale's population. In almost every book on Scarsdale, Wikipedia, state and federal reports, and I always found that it was curious. So, and you see the reason for that the number declined, the vast majority of farmers, and why. Now, I know that second sentence isn't true. The influx of commuters didn't happen until the 20th century. So, citation needed. Yeah, definitely citation needed on that one. But, so it seems kind of curious. And then when I graphed it, and hopefully you can see from where you're at, so we have from, I'll just say by background, and this will become relevant. The years ending in 0 are federal censuses. The years ending in 5 are state censuses, which they did back then, and that'll be relevant in a sec. So we have 1830, Scarsdale's population is 317. 1835, it's credited as 329, and then the 1840 year, we jump down a 22% decline to 255 people. And then 1845, it bounces back up to 341, and 1850, it's at 342. So it's strange, you've got this very sleepy farming community experiencing a major disruption. You're losing a fifth of your people in a 5-year period. That's a substantial exodus. And then it bounces back. So the question was, why? And this is a photo from some 60 years later. This is Crane Berkeley. This would have been somewhat of what Scarsdale looked like back then. This post road up top, and it's just kind of farms. So the initial decline was commonly attributed to Scarsdale's landlocked geography. So they would say that this is Scarsdale in the middle. You've got this kind of red horse's head here. And it also had rocky, uneven farmland. Now, the Bronx River was a little bit wider before the Kensico Dam was built in 1885, but it was never navigable. And the Hutchinson River here is not navigable. So if you are a farmer in Scarsdale, how do you get your crops down to New York City? So if you are in Greenburgh, or if you are over here in the river towns in Yonkers down here, or if you're in Rye, or you're in Eastchester, which at that point had water access, you put your stuff on a barge and you take it down to the city. But Scarsdale here was landlocked. So the only way to get your crops out would be on Post Road. That meant it was too slow for dairy products and just slow and cumbersome in general. That was the reason given. That reason never made a lot of sense to me because we were landlocked in 1830 and 1850 just as well as we were in 1840. So why are all of a sudden people leaving? But that's the reason that's commonly given. This is a beautiful painting of Tarrytown, just to give you an idea of the contrast. This is the old Dutch church here, and this is the Hudson River, and it's much more happening than Scarsdale was in that period. So then they credit the population rebound to the arrival of the railroad, which happened in the mid-1840s, but you already saw that the population bumped up by 1845. Plus, this was not a commuting railroad at that time, so you wouldn't have had that many people coming in here. So none of the reasons made sense. I looked into historical things, wars, famines, whatever you might have. There didn't seem to be any societal upheaval that would explain why people would be leaving Scarsdale at this time. Town borders didn't change, nothing like that. So I started digging into the census data. So this is the way the census looked then. You would have the enumerator, or the assistant marshal up top. Then you would only have the heads of household listed. You didn't have everybody listed, so you would have their name, and then they would just go across with tally marks of how many people were there. Free males, free females, white, free colored persons over here, males, females. Then there was another page for enslaved people, which there were none in New York at that point. So then you would have the total number of people, and then coming down here, you have the number 255. So that's the number enumerated on the sheet. This page is the second page. This is a carryover from the previous page. But this is what it looked like. And so I took all the census data and I took all the people, the heads of households in 1830, 1840, 1850, put them into a big spreadsheet to start to look at that. And one of the curious things is that there were some residents who were present in 1830, absent in 1840, and present again in 1850. Particular people. So not like some people left and some people came back. And then there were some really strange ones of these heads of household who were absent there, and many of them were quite prominent. So 6 of these had children in Scarsdale School District number 1 in 1840, but they apparently weren't living in Scarsdale in 1840. That's weird. Richard Carpenter in 1840 was the Scarsdale Schools Commissioner, so how could he not be around? Nathaniel Brown, his house is on Mamaroneck Road. He was the Commissioner of Highways in 1838 and Justice of the Peace in 1841 and 1842. So it doesn't seem possible that all of these people left Scarsdale, but maintained in that era, hopped on a horse or walked to Scarsdale to perform jobs for the residents of Scarsdale. So I decided to compare Scarsdale against neighboring communities to see what was happening with them at that time. Were there any trends away from Westchester, trends between communities, and so on? And the first oddity, I'll take you through this because it may be a little slow. So the blue line is Eastchester. The red line is Mamaroneck. Mamaroneck is like the mirror of Scarsdale. It's the opposite. It's experiencing a large increase in 1840, then a decrease down to 1845. Then you've got New Rochelle, which is booming. You've got White Plains, which is experiencing steady growth. And then you've got Scarsdale, which is, it's hard to see from the scale, but this is the dip that we're talking about. In Scarsdale, again, in that whole era, because it was inferior, the population was so much lower than the neighboring communities. It hadn't caught up like it has much more today because, again, the crops and the transportation and the rocky farmland and stuff like that. I'd like to talk to you about the census, which is, I think, I could only get so far by looking at some of the data. I wanted to understand, well, how was the census done? So in 1840, the U.S. Marshals for the various districts of, oftentimes it would be a state of the U.S., but sometimes it was broken down into less than a state, would appoint assistant marshals, these temporary assistant marshals, to go out and count. So unlike today, when you have armies of enumerators, then it often went down to just a couple of people, 1 or 2 people, who were going out and counting everybody. They had to make an inquiry of every head of family. They got $2 for every 100 people they counted. They had to start on June 1st, 1840, and they had to finish by November 1st of the same year. So they had 5 months to cover it. They were supposed to be persons of, quote, assiduous industry, active intelligence, pure integrity, great facility and accuracy of computation, with, quote, an intimate knowledge of the division allotted to them. It was, however, a known problem that the territory that the assistant marshal had to cover could be too large. And some assistant marshals were not so familiar with the people and the territory that they were charged with covering. So this is what might be how one of these marshals traveled. This is not a marshal, but that might be kind of what it looked like around then. So this is what Westchester County in 1840 looked like. It was larger than today, not physically, but politically, because not only, and again, you can see Scarsdale here, we've got the Horse's Head, we've got large swaths of northern Westchester, and it also contains the town of Westchester, which we know now as the Bronx. The Bronx so down here at the bottom, the Bronx wound up eating up This on the west side of the Bronx River, it ate up about a third of Yonkers, and then on the west side and the east side, about 20 years later in the 1890s, ate up a bunch more, including Pelham, City Island, bottom part, Eastchester. Eastchester wound up losing a bunch of it to the city of Mount Vernon when that was created. So, but this was all that the assistant marshal, was charged with covering. I was able to look in the census records and figure out the order in which the marshal proceeded. He starts off in Mount Pleasant. He basically worked his way, came into here, and then he worked his way south, and then he kind of came up, and then the rest of this was covered. Incidentally, I'll just tell you because I find it interesting. The town of Westchester, down here, was created in 1667, the colonial era, right? And then that and Eastchester were named after Chester in England. So you had Westchester, which was basically southwest, and then Eastchester, which was kind of northeast. And the county of Westchester was named after the town of Westchester, which was the seat. When that was absorbed into the Bronx, now Westchester is just an area of the Bronx. So you have the county, we've got a sort of a ghost left. Our whole county is named after a town that no longer exists. So who was the assistant marshal? So signed all over the census records, William J. Van Tassel. And what's kind of cool is it's the old spelling. It looks like a P, like a strange P, meaning the double S, which is really cool. So Scarsdale, White Plains, and he's credited up here in its enumeration made by William J. Van Tassel, assistant marshal, etc. So he's all over that. And so he signed almost every page except for a little bit up in Pound Ridge and Bedford. And I wanted to figure out who he was. So there were a few. There was none in Scarsdale. That's a Dutch name that tends to be more on the west side by the Hudson River. I'm reasonably confident that our William Van Tassel is from the town of Mount Pleasant, and I'll give you a few reasons. It's near the Hudson River. First, he signed his name William J. Van Tassel here, and when he enumerated people, he didn't use middle initials almost for anyone, except for, I believe, himself, when he counted himself in Mount Pleasant. So that was interesting. Second, he's about the right age. So he was also basically the right sort of life situation and education. So at the time of the 1840 census, he was 20 years old. The assistant marshal position is a young man's job for a few reasons. It's physically active. You're going all over Westchester on a horse. It's an almost half-year gig where you don't go home every night or very rarely. So that means that if you have a family, you might not want to leave them, and probably more important in that era, if you have a farm or a business, it's difficult to leave that. So if you are in the prime of what you're doing as whatever it is, it's a little bit harder to do that. He did have 7 children in his life, but in 1840, he didn't have any yet. So he didn't have to absent himself, I think, from anything significant. And then also, in his life, he was a carpenter. And it looks also like he served as a coroner, and which would make sense because a carpenter would be somebody who's like physically building caskets, right? That's an easy adjacency. But I think you would need to have some reading and writing education probably to do that. And in that era, clerically proficient people were less common than today. So then the final reason is that Pound Ridge and Bedford were counted and signed by one Gilbert Van Tassel, who was a 40-year-old shoemaker who lived in Bedford, but he was baptized in the Dutch Reformed Church in Tarrytown, right next to Sleepy Hollow, which is that whole area. So I think he was a relative of William J. Van Tassel of Mount Pleasant. He asked his relative to do the northern part of the county, either because he was more familiar with it or possibly because he was running out of time. And then finally, we know that the assistant marshal started counting in Mount Pleasant. So I think the reasonable thing is he left his door and started counting his community, and then he spread out from there. So I think he started there, he moved out from there. It's a long-winded way of saying that William J. Van Tassel was not familiar with Scarsdale. He was from nowhere near, and he really wouldn't have occasion. Nobody at that time would have had occasion to go to Scarsdale. It was not a place to be visiting. The next step towards solving this mystery was when I got hold of an 1851 map of Scarsdale that I'd never seen before. It's close enough to 1840 that I figured that the landowners on there, many of them would be the same as in 1840. There was less, the transportation was worse then, and people tended to stay in one place for longer. You're farming, the taxes are low, so they're not like forcing you to White Plains or whatever after your kids are done with the schools. This was like a multi-generational thing, right? You see Cornells and Griffins and people like that for hundreds of years here. So I figured, I could look at this and see how that matched up with the census. Now, this only contains the landowners, not renters, and renters would be counted in the census as well. So not everybody's going to be in there. And I'll just point out that in the mid-1800s, Scarsdale had very few roads. So for example, like Weaver Street, if you're coming out of Mamaroneck, the first street you get to is Crossway. Daisy Farms then was also called Crossway. None of those streets were there. And in fact, Weaver ended here. It did not go up to the Five Corners. But very few, just kind of the main streets, and most of the residences are not on the side streets. Most of them are on just a few of the main streets. These numbers here represent the people counted in Scarsdale. Every person who appeared in this 1840 census, I plotted on the 1851 map. And I went in the order in which they were listed. There were 35 entries for Scarsdale, but everybody's not represented. So there's some gaps in the numbers because, again, it's 11 years later. Somebody may have moved. B, you might be renting, so you don't appear on the map even though you're on the census. This kind of broke the thing open for me because what I realized was that the order in which people are listed on the census match the route in which somebody would be taking. That he didn't collect the data and then take tables of it and put it, say, in alphabetical order or something like that later. But this is actually the route he walked. He had a pen and a ledger and would put people in the order in which he was riding. So he started on Post Road by White Plains and worked his way down, counting as he went until he got to Eastchester. I don't know. I doubt that he went back to Secor Road and counted from here. I suspect when he got to Eastchester, he turned the page to the Eastchester page, continued on there, or something like that. And later, when his travels carried him around here, he finished Scarsdale up. So this is basically it. This is I think, the route that that Van Tassel went, which is wild to be able to think about, the actual path he took. So then I went through all of the New Rochelle and Mamaroneck residents, of which there are many more. There's only 35 households in Scarsdale, there's 240 in Mamaroneck, 280 in New Rochelle. And I found some weird stuff. So here, these green ones are people who are attributed to New Rochelle, but are clearly in Scarsdale. And these here, the yellow ones, are people who are attributed to Mamaroneck, but are in Scarsdale. Or actually, not just in Scarsdale, some of them are in New Rochelle. So this is like the numbers correspond to their censuses. I think Van Tassel made 3 mistakes in when he was walking around. So number 1, he started Mamaroneck too early. He was in Scarsdale on Mamaroneck Road, and I think he started attributing people to Mamaroneck. The very first page of the Mamaroneck, number 2 here, that's a Scarsdale resident. I don't know how that happened. I can't explain it. Unless I can't explain it. I speculate a fair amount in this. I can't even speculate on this one. So that's, I think, the first mistake. The largest mistake that he makes is he does all this counting in Mamaroneck. and he comes up Weaver Street. He's coming up here. And when you get to the Scarsdale border, or the border of Mamaroneck, on the right side is Scarsdale, on the left side is New Rochelle. And he walks all the way up, and he attributes all those people to Mamaroneck. And then, when he gets to the first street he can get to, which is Crossway, he makes a left on what's now Daisy Farms Road. He continues into New Rochelle. He's still counting. He's still giving credit to all these people to Mamaroneck. And he comes all the way down here, and then he figures it out. And then here, he starts counting, he starts attributing these people correctly to New Rochelle, which is pretty wild. So why didn't he realize, after all this, what was going on? So the first is, he didn't know the area, right? The second is, he's paid by the number of people he counts, right? So precision may be less important than speed. And then the third reason is very cool, and it really has to do with the border, and that the border, at that point particularly, was not that apparent. This is what it looks like now. So you've got the farm stand on the right. We're looking south towards Mamaroneck, and you just got kind of bushes and things like that here, and that's kind of it. It looks almost ruralish, and then there's a sign there. But back then, it was a little bit different. So I'll give you the background, because this is also, it's tangential, but it's very cool. So Richard Cornell was a Quaker who settled in Scarsdale in 1727 in this area here. You can still see descendants from our map from the mid-1800s. They're still there. He anchored a community then known as, and now, as Quaker Ridge. And this ridge was a physical line that didn't adhere to the boundaries. You see, it's right on the edge here between New Rochelle and Mamaroneck and Scarsdale. So they created a Quaker school that was originally located just across the line into New Rochelle, but that school educated kids from all three communities because it was one Quaker community. So the political boundary didn't matter. Because it presented as one community, how was William Van Tassel to know that he was sort of leaving one area and going to another? It's not like you have a settlement in a quiet area where you might find a border. There was no river or natural border like between Scarsdale and Greenburgh, where you have the Bronx River, or something to clue him in. So he also would have seen homes. He would have seen this a Quaker school there. This may not have been the Quaker school that was in there in 1840, but it was a very kind of busy area. He would have seen the Quaker meeting house. This was the view of all those trees. This is the same view that you're seeing, but without all those trees there. So you would have seen the Quaker meeting house there, and you would have seen other homes. So it looked kind of like a dense area. So it just didn't clue him in that he was leaving. His third mistake, I think, was this I'm not as confident about, but I think there's a chance of it, that he was coming across Wilmot in New Rochelle. He was counting correctly, and he hit the Sheldrake River. So I'll show you what the Sheldrake River is. This is looking west of Wilmot. This is the Golden Horseshoe. The Sheldrake River, it's still there. So I suspect that he was walking northeast on the road. He comes to the river, and that's a natural boundary, and he follows it. And I think he may have been turned 90 degrees and thought that was the Hutchinson River. And the Hutchinson River is the boundary. This is what the Sheldrake River looks like now when you go back behind the Golden Horseshoe. So there could have been a path there. That's not an unlikely supposition. And I think he may have thought that he was staying in New Rochelle and counting correctly by following the path of the river. And there was no other homes there, so he just kind of followed it and followed it and followed it until he gets to Mamaroneck Road. It's been, obviously, that's the Sheldrake River, but it's been put into a little canal there. So this is behind the middle school, and you'll see Mamaroneck Road up there. He gets to Mamaroneck Road. This is what I think happened up there. So it's his first road that he comes to, and he does the same thing. He just makes a left. So he came up here, and he made a left here, and he's still attributing everybody to New Rochelle. He counts a few people, and then he stops attributing to New Rochelle when he gets near Post Road. So there's a couple of ways that he might have figured out that he was in the wrong place. He might have recognized Post Road from a previous, because that was kind of the main artery. He also would have passed a Scarsdale school there, the Scarsdale school there. Maybe there was a sign in it that literally said Scarsdale, or something else that said Scarsdale, and he's like, he's already written down so many people and attributed them to the wrong place in ink on his ledger book. And it's basically, I think, what's he gonna do? Like literally, like he's getting paid to count people. The overall Westchester count would be probably correct. I don't know how much it mattered either way. And remember, he had 5 months to complete it. He doesn't get paid more for going back or getting it right. He had to hustle. He actually finished and submitted his paperwork on October 31st, which was the day before the deadline, after handing off 2 towns to his relative Gilbert. So he interviewed about 8,000 heads of household in 5 months. So that's about 50 homes a day, assuming he never went home and never took a day off. So the other question that I don't know the answer to is why he never asked somebody, what town am I in? That I don't know. I can't deny that he was attributing them to the wrong one, but I don't know whether he just, I don't know what the questions were. If the questions are literally, how many people live here? How many males of this race over this age, under that age? How many women of this age? And he just does that. And maybe that was an error in how he was instructed to proceed. Because that seems like the sort of thing. Now again, if you know a 20-year-old, maybe he's embarrassed, maybe he's clueless. I couldn't tell you the reason for that, but the outcome, I think, is clear. Going back to Wikipedia, so Scarsdale's population did not drop significantly. I think I'm safe in saying that 255 was not a result of people leaving, but it was a counting error. And so what should the revised census number be? So I'm gonna ballpark it at 335, just based on kind of straight line math. I'm doing it in part because the 1835 and the off-year censuses were indeed conducted by Scarsdale resident. So for example, 1845 was conducted by Scarsdale resident William Cornell, descendant of Cornell, the original Cornell family, so this was 110 years later. So he would have known everybody. He might have barely needed to walk in order to know who lived where, or at least he was able to do it without much. So I think because he had familiarity with it, he had much higher accuracy. So I credit these numbers. So I suspect that the number is probably something like that, and that we were undercounted by 80 residents, or about 24%. And that's where we're at. So questions, comments, alternative theories. BK, what do you think?